Hello and good morning, everyone. Hi, thank you so much for coming to joining us for our talk series this morning. Albert, I have quite an echo up here on this mic. Does it sound okay in the audience? Okay, good. No echo? Perfect. Must be the acoustics. Okay, so my name is Zoe Burkholder. I'm a professor in the Department of Educational Foundations and one of the people who's helping to organize this talk series for the year. So this talk series is called Critical Scholarship at CEEL. That's the College for Education and Engaged Learning. And once a month, we're going to bring somebody in to speak who is doing amazing scholarship in the field of education broadly conceived. So we are very excited this morning to have our new colleague in the Department of Educational Foundations, Dr. Wendy Castillo, who is here with us today. I'm going to read her bio and then invite her up here, and she's going to talk about her current research. And we're going to save plenty of time at the end of her talk for Q&A. So the whole program is about an hour. She will talk for as long as she feels like talking, and then we will give you all a chance to ask questions. So as she's speaking, see if you can think of something that you have a question about, or that you're confused about, or that you're surprised about, or that you'd like to know more about, because we'd love to hear your feedback. Sound good? Okay, great. Thank you so much. Okay, so Dr. Wendy Castillo is an assistant professor in urban education and quantitative methods in the Department of Ed Foundations. She is the co-author of a new book, How to QuantCrit, Applying Critical Race Theory to Quantitative Data in Education. Before arriving here at Montclair State University, Dr. Castillo worked with nonprofit organizations to advance educational equality, including a role as the Senior Director of Equity, Data, and Impact at the National Urban League, where she led their data strategy and program evaluation efforts. She also has experience with quantitative research methods, including large-scale randomized controlled trials, meta-analysis, cost analysis, measurement, design, and validation. Just like to say for the record, I don't really know what any of those things are, but they sound very important and frankly hard to do. Her research interests lay at the intersection of race and quantitative data and methods, including QuantCrit, and racial equity frameworks to advance and improve the lives of students of color. And that's what she'll be talking with us about in just a minute. Interestingly, Dr. Castillo actually started her career in Teach for America as an elementary school teacher in the Miami-Dade Public Schools, where she created an after-school dance club for students in the community. She credits both as being influential experiences in her professional career. She has a Ph.D. in Ed Policy from the University of Pennsylvania, a master's in Educational and Social Change from the University of Miami, and a bachelor's degree in International Relations from Brown University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Castillo.
Now for does the technology work part? If you could help me with, oh wait, is this the clicker? Do I have the wrong clicker? I had the wrong clicker. So I just wanted to acknowledge my co-author Camden Strong. So this is the book that is coming out. It comes out in exactly 1 month and it will be free for everybody. So I encourage everybody to download it. And if you really want to, you can buy it as well. Oh, okay. Yeah. And then I wanted to also acknowledge my co-author, David Gilborn, who's inspired a lot of this work. Okay. So I have a couple of objectives. I was a teacher, so we have objectives when we give presentations. I find healing in this work, and I hope that you can find healing in it too. I like to use bell hooks' quote, "For in its production lies a hope of our liberation." The production of making theory into practice is what I find healing in, and I find hope in. I want to briefly go over the history of statistics and critical quantitative frameworks, and then review QuantCrit, and hopefully you can leave with some practices today. I know some of you have attended my job talk before, but I hope you could still learn some things because I have updated this presentation. So as an icebreaker, and please feel free to shout them out or just say them in a normal voice, what words come to mind when you think of quantitative data? Are there any words, numbers, that is a definitely large samples, large sets of numbers. Anything else that comes to mind? I heard somebody say math. Yeah. Math, numbers, large sets of data. Sampling. People. Hopefully we can start thinking more of people when we hear this, but definitely I think what is it? Interesting. I have never had anyone say that one before. So I just wanted to see what you were thinking. Sometimes people talk about objectiveness. Sometimes people talk about neutrality, or they talk about oppression, things like that. So before we get started with any other, now it's not working. Oh, do I have to go like that? Oh. Did I hear the da, 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 da. Well, the next slide is about the history of statistics. I think we went. The next slide is about that. I wanted to talk about the history of statistics. So before any presentation, I think it's really, really important to think about where stats comes from, and they come from the eugenics movement. So statistical methods are rooted in the eugenics movement. And for those of you who don't know what eugenicism is, it's the idea of proving that one race is superior than the other. Usually the white race is superior than the Black race. And it came out in the 1800s. And here are the fathers of statistics and of eugenics. And they really gave a scientific backing to statistics. So it's really important to acknowledge that in any presentation that I give in statistics, because now I want to use data for justice. So it's important to acknowledge where it comes from. And it's still happening today in the sense that just as briefly as recently as 1994, the bell curve, this book over here, came out saying that the reason that men and women are different and the reason that different races have differences is due to genetics. And it's not due to systemic discrimination. So yes, this happened in the 1800s, but it continued throughout after World War II, and it's even as recently as 1994. So this is still happening. And then I just want to quickly go back and talk about how this is a process of unlearning what we learned. So most of us have taken a quantitative class, and for you freshmen, like you're gonna, I think, take a quantitative class maybe in your undergrad, and you're gonna most likely learn it from a very traditional lens. And that traditional lens is gonna be talking about how numbers are objective and how numbers are neutral. So it's this process of unlearning everything we've learned and trying to relearn it through a new approach. And it's unsettling. And there aren't steps, and there's never going to be step 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5, because we are iterating and we're learning, and the world is changing, and the way racism unfolds is changing. So this process is going to be a never-ending learning process. So it's a little bit unsettling. So QuantCrit, what it does is it looks at numbers and it looks at them and examines how they have disguised racism to perpetuate the status quo. And it's a framework that I use for research and policy making. So it stems from critical race theory. And the first tenet is the centrality of racism, and that is the basis of critical race theory. So there's a lot of misconceptions of what critical race theory is, but one of the main tenets is the foundation, centrality, and prevalence of racism, and that is tenet number 1 in QuantCrit. The second tenet is that numbers are not neutral. So we are rejecting the idea that numbers are neutral. The third is that categories are not neutral. Categories are chosen by the elites usually, and the practices that we practice. So right now, the categories that we think about in race very often are white, Black, Asian, Latino, and then many times it's just other or mixed race. And that is not neutral. That is picked by somebody and practices that we have perpetuated. Voice and insight data cannot speak for itself. And social justice, equity orientation. So data can't speak for itself. We speak for the data. And I at least speak for the data in a social justice orientation. So how familiar are you with QuantCrit? If people could put up from 1 being not very familiar to 5 being super familiar with their hands. So QuantCrit comes from critical race theory. And as I said before, critical race theory's foundation is the centrality of racism. And it really emerged out of a critical framework. And that critical framework was from Derek Bell. And you can see Derek Bell on the left here. I like to look at who we're always talking about. So Derek Bell, he was a legal scholar. And Kimberly Crenshaw, she's also a scholar who talks a lot about intersectionality, and Richard Delgado, who talks a lot about lat crit. And basically, it emerged out of a framework that said we have critical legal studies, and critical legal studies. I feel like I'm just loud enough by myself, but I don't know. So critical legal studies was. Ooh, did I do that? I don't think I did that. Like, I don't think I did that. So critical legal studies was criticizing that laws were not neutral, and that laws were also not objective. And these scholars came and said, but it's not just about like the laws not being neutral. It's not just about socioeconomic status. We need to really center on race. And so that's what they wanted to do. And that's how they came up with critical race theory. And QuantCrit takes the lessons that they brought in critical race theory and attempts to apply them to quantitative numbers. So there's critical theory and critical quantitative inquiry. And I know this is a lot of jargon for you all, but they're different. QuantCrit is different from these. QuantCrit is centering on critical race theory. It is centering on race. Critical theory is not. Critical theory is an approach that comes from the Frankfurt School, from Marxism. And it's just really looking at things through a critical social historical lens. Critical quantitative inquiry came out of critical theory, and they said, well, we don't think things are neutral. We think that things are shaped by societal factors, environmental factors, but they were not focused on race. And that is a distinction. They were focused on other factors, which is, sometimes I apply this framework when I'm not focusing on race, but QuantCrit is about race. And what these critical scholars did before QuantCrit, and QuantCrit stems from this, is they said, we want to have 3 commitments of how we do critical quantitative work. And they are to use data to represent the inequalities, use data to also question the models, question the measurements, and do culturally relevant research. And you can see in these 3 commitments, there's no mention of race. You might be alluding to race, but there is no mention of race. So did you guys ever consider other critical approaches with QuantCrit? Because I've heard a lot, I used to do it myself, be like, yeah, crit quant, but it's a little bit different. They are a little bit different. Has anyone ever confused the 2? Or maybe you've never heard of either of them, so it's okay. So there's no confusion. Yeah.
I didn't know the difference because I'm not in the field at all. But for the critical, the one that's on the right, and critical, critical quantitative. So that could almost kind of accidentally discover a basic genocide.
Yes.
That's the theory that's focused on. Let's look at race first and see what the numbers tell us.
Yes. So QuantCrit, which I'll talk a little bit more about, acknowledges that racism exists and is prevalent. And now that we know that, how do we do our quantitative work? This one is not doing that. This one is acknowledging that there are social factors, that there's like environmental factors that affect the way we do research. So I just want to, yeah. Well, Yes, it's to be explicit about race, because then we can get into, which happens a lot, like race evasion. We're talking about classism, but classism is directly related to racism. So it's the idea of being very explicit about, we're talking about race. We're not using race evasive terms. But sometimes when my research is not about race and it's about something else, I use critical quantitative work. So I just want to acknowledge those who have come before me. I'm not the first person who's talking about these issues, particularly Zuberi and Bonilla Silva, White Logic, Wet Methods, Chicago and beyond, Child Trends. Some of the big research firms have tried to think about these things, and W.E.B. Du Bois, who in 1900 looked at what Black America looks like and used data to uplift inequalities using geospatial by hand. So you can see he did like mapping by hand to look at counties. So I think to me, that was the first person to really do QuantCrit over 100 years ago. So the first tenet is the centrality of racism. So we're saying that race is a social construct. And if you don't do a CRT analysis, then you run the risk of remaking and legitimizing existing inequalities. So the first thing that you can do, as I said before, is you start your project with the acknowledgement that racism exists and is prevalent. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means you might ask different questions, you might have different measures, and you might have different models. So here on the right-hand side, I have new reframing versus on the left-hand side, which I have old reframing, which you can see it says, 2 fifth grade students' reading scores differ by racial category. Now, we know they do because racism exists. So now that we know that they exist, now we have a new question to ask. The question might be, what resources or supports would be needed to rectify the historic under-resourcing of communities of color? How are schools and society underserving youth of color in the area of reading? So you're asking a different question because you already know that those inequities exist because we've caused them through racism. Similar here. Are high school rates lower for students of color? Because racism exists and they don't have access to resources, they are. So you ask, what are the structural resource and systemic factors that influence graduation rates? How are these factors distributed differently by race? What resources would be needed to rectify the decades of neglect of these schools for predominantly students of color? So here I have a prompt. So let's start with just the first one. Are Black students less likely to persist in STEM majors in college? How would we reframe that one? Does anybody, I'm looking at the professors, want to give it a shot? Yeah, it says, are Black students less likely to persist in STEM majors in college? Yeah, that would be good. And also like the STEM in high school, I'm thinking of that. Riva, did you want to try too? I saw. I think those are exactly on. So here we have what resources and supports would they need to invest. I think barriers would go right into that. What is the composition of STEM faculty? How do Black students experience the campus? So there are ways of thinking about questions differently. That's one, like step number one. So you acknowledge that racism exists. So we know that Black students are less likely to persist in STEM majors because STEM majors have been racialized as a white male major. So we know that because racism exists. So let's think about the question one step further. Another thing you can do is define race and racism. I've been doing this review recently and no one ever wants to, I don't know if they don't want to, but no one ever defines race and racism. So it's very important to define what you mean when you're talking about race and racism, and they're not interchangeable ideas. And make sure that your definitions align with QuantCrit if you are doing a QuantCrit project. You also want to avoid race evasive terms. So we talk about diversity, but diversity can mean a lot of different things. So don't use race evasive terms, use the terms that you mean. So if you're talking about Black students, you say Black students. If you're talking about racism, you define racism versus if you're talking about someone's race. So one thing that I was taught to do in my graduate program is that I control for race in my model. But when you control for race in your model, we just want to make sure we're not saying we're controlling for racism. Because if we want to measure racism, we need measures of racism. And we need to talk about which type of racism we're talking about. Systemic, institutional, intrapersonal, interpersonal, and then make a measure for that. So here are some examples of measures, and I'm not endorsing these measures, but these are what exists, and we can be better, but these are what exists to measure racism in youth in schools. So there's the Adolescent Discrimination Distress Scale, and it asks things like, you were discouraged from joining an advanced level class. There's the Index of Race-Related Stress. You were passed over for an important school project, although you were better at the task than the white non-Black person given the task. There's a Perceived Racism Scale, which asks things like, whites often don't include me in study groups. There's the Everyday Discrimination Scale, which is your teachers treat you with less respect than other students. Your teachers act as if they are afraid of you. There's Racial and Ethnic Microaggression Scale, which is somebody assumed that I would have a lower educational background because of my race. So there are scales that we can use, but if you guys want to create new scales, we likely do, because racism and race in this country has changed. So these citations you can see are from 93, 96, even 2011. Race has changed. So the way we perceive change in this country has changed. So it's important to be updating these. So that's just a call to the field. But people have also thought about it in interesting ways to measure systemic and structural racism. They have looked through GIS to think about how different policies affect different places and disproportionality. People have looked at merging different data sets to create school level structural racism based on student demographics, sense of connectedness, perceived life chances, discipline, and school metric data. So they combined all of those to create some type of school level metric. In health, Mendez et al. Used neighborhood redlining as a tool for institutional racism and did predicted probabilities of preterm births. So if we want to measure racism, we need to just get a little bit more creative on how we're measuring it and then the tools we're using. So it could be beyond surveys. We could think about these tools. Then we want to avoid the use of white-centric models, variables, and analysis. And what does that mean? And before I talk about what that means, who has used a white reference group in their research? It could be quant or qual. I have. No one else has. Okay. When you compare your results to white students, so you say Black students scored 5 points lower than white students, or Latino students scored. Okay. Yes. I agree. Yeah, I talk about it statistically, but it could happen in qualitative research as well. So we want to avoid using a white reference group because that centers whiteness, that normalizes whiteness, and others everybody else. So white becomes the ideal that we want to reach, and everybody else is other and different. However, I know there are grants and I know there are journal articles that might require that. The idea of using white as a reference group is to, if you do it unintentionally without thinking about why you're doing it, that's what we want to avoid. but you might still do it. And in this example, they use white high-income women as a reference group because they're talking about educational attainment, and they have the highest educational attainment. And they said, we're using them for that reason. And if we were talking about a wage equity study, we would use white men. So it's okay still to use white students as a reference group, but you don't want to do it without an absence of really thinking about why you're doing it. But there are alternatives. I always like to offer alternatives. So where do we want our Black and brown children to be? So in my opinion, I don't think white children in this country are reading at levels that I would feel comfortable with, are doing math at levels that I would feel comfortable with. So if we close the white and Black gap or the white and Latino gap, everybody still can't really read right, in my opinion. So I think it's important for us to set goals of where we want. So we're not anchoring high enough. We need to anchor higher. Where do we want the livable median income to be? If it is what white individuals have, is that enough to live a life that we think is a dignified life where you're not worrying about rent and basic necessities? So we need to set those. So that's one thing you can do. Don't compare to where white people are, compare where you think. And that will vary by place and will vary by values and where we want our students to be. You can also do effect coding for those of you who are more quantitative people. In your statistical model, you can do an effect coding, and the coding is not that difficult. And what it does is it compares to the average. So now you're not saying Black students compared to the average. You're not comparing to a white centered norm. Or you can just look at within school comparisons. So here we have access to post-secondary enrollment rates, and it is by Asian populations, and they vary widely. So perhaps we don't even need to compare to white individuals. There's enough variation and diversity within a one racial or ethnic group. So there are alternatives for things we can do. Yes.
Why comparing racial groups, considering how problematic the concept of race is? Like, what's the goal?
Yeah, I think the goal is to get to a place where we don't need to measure like your race. However, I associate getting race data with getting funding and money to communities. So if we stop measuring that, I think that money to those communities will go down. But I think race is made up. So I think eventually like that is where you get, because we're just making like, that's why there's no way to measure it correctly, no correct categories, because we made it up. Yeah, there are. I talk about some of the better labels because I think the ones we have now are not good enough. And just for those quanti people, if you say, oh, our sample sizes are too small, then there are non-parametric methods that you can use. And here are the equivalents that you can use with sample sizes of 10. So rather than doing the t-test, which you all will learn in your statistics course, you can do the Wilcoxon t. Rather than doing a one-way ANOVA, you could do a Kruskal-Wallis H. So there are different, so a lot of people say, oh, we just had a sample size of 7. You can still preserve privacy and do it with non-parametric methods. The next tenet that I'm going to go through is that numbers are not neutral. They're usually gathered and reflect the interests and assumptions of the elites. So one thing we can do is switch from an outputs to an inputs approach. So for example, when we're trying to capture barriers and injustices that shape equitable outcomes, we think about disciplinary rates, and that's the outcome. How discipline rates vary by race, that's the outcome. But rather than thinking about the outcome, thinking about the input. So data, quantitative data on class sizes, on student support ratios, on race ethnicity of teachers, on school resource officers, on school climate data. So think about what are the inputs instead of us thinking about what are the outputs approach. We are researchers, so we get that that flexibility, because I know those who are working at the school district level don't get the flexibility of having to like look at the inputs because they're being pressured to look at the outputs. But similar here for a Latino completion rate, look at the funding per pupil, look at the retention rates, look at the type of institution that Latinos are enrolling in. financial aid, and the representation of Latino staff. So look at those inputs rather than just saying, there's low Latino college rate. Well, let's think about what are some of those things that could be contributing to it and get the numbers on those things. Again, the avoiding the use of white-centric variables. When you do statistics, models don't happen by themselves, although we have AI now and they might do the models by themselves. But usually we pick what goes into the model, and we pick based on our biases, our assumptions, our backgrounds. So we usually don't weigh the lived experience of those we're doing research on. So one thing to do is think about, rather than focusing on prior literature, which has centered on white middle-class children, think about the lived experiences of students of color. Many times I was taught, and if you can raise your hand too, if you were to control for SES and academic achievement in your model, if you have the data, you control it and you put it in your model. Did anybody else do that? Yeah, I was taught to do that. I don't know if I was taught explicitly, but I was definitely taught to do that. When you put all SES and prior achievement in your model, you soak up so much of the variation that what's left is not a lot to explain. And so what does that mean? It means that when students attend schools because they are of a lower socioeconomic status, those are not devoid of racism. They experience racism in their prior achievement. They experience racism because of their SES. And in some ways, you're controlling away and erasing a lot of those racial inequities. So one thing that I recommend is to always do just the regular bivariate analyses, as well as potentially the other one because your professor or the journal article is asking you to do that. But thinking about these variables that go in that are soaking up all the inequities that students experience. Yes, Dorothy? Socioeconomic status. Sorry. Did you have a question? Yes. This is Dorothy's class. Dorothy's class is leaving. Can everyone else feel free to come forward?
Think we've got a solution, I'm not sure.
Well, I'm not ignoring it. I just want to look at whatever intervention in an intervention sense and look at that relationship without having all of these other factors that could have washed away a lot of the racism that students experience. It's just a different way of looking at it, especially I was trained with economists and they usually do like 30 models. I was like, well, then why not do a model that also looks at things without having it be washed away? Looking at it just in isolation, which is very basic, looking at things in isolation. I think less complication, less advanced models are always better, less assumptions that you have to make.
So basically, you're
No, this is not just disaggregating the data, but if you're looking at like, for example, you're looking at intervention, did this intervention A increase reading? Well, if you put in prior reading and if you put in SES, the intervention, likely you're gonna like see nothing because all those different factors contributed to like where they are now in the reading. So it's just important to look at it without it, if that makes sense. We'll talk about disaggregation later, but.
Data is the data. The question of how do we make sense of the data, that's when, and depending on the question, that's where then we could, explore, what are those variables, right? But if you're, and yet, my understanding is that you're really looking at how do we gather data that really speaks for itself.
Well, we still will speak for it, but better data that will speak for these things, yes. But I still want to disaggregate it, and I'll get to the disaggregated data part. In that sense, I guess you can call it stepwise. Yeah, just thinking about it just in isolation without putting all those other variables that are going to cloud what you're trying to look at. Yeah. But I think we're always taught to put everything in there and then be like, oh, well, after you control for this, it doesn't matter anymore. But I'm like, but controlling for that, controlled for all of what they're experiencing. So maybe it does matter, is what I'm trying to say. Then merging data sets. And I just want to be clear that if you merge data sets and you pre-register your study, you're not doing QuantCrit or you're not being critical. You have to have an intention. And the reason is that a lot of people after the fact will do a lot of like p-hacking to try to like get, oh, we found a result for the indigenous population. So you're doing it ahead of time and saying, my intention is to do a racial equity approach. I'm going to disaggregate like this, and I'm going to look at this. And it's not like, oh, I just need to find a star in statistics. So the idea is that. The reason you want to integrate and merge data sets is because that's how you can get a more multidimensional measure of vulnerable student populations. The more vulnerable student populations are, the more difficult it is to get data on. This one was one on homelessness populations. And what they did is they merged data sets and were able to see that actually the homelessness population has adults that get actual earnings of $2,000 a year from the government. But they didn't know that this happened until you merge multiple data sets, because getting data on people who don't have a home is very difficult because they do not, there's a reason they are hard to find. So this is important to do, but it also requires a lot of resources to have data sets to be able to merge the data sets. But it allows you to get a more multidimensional view than looking at one data set. Then again, pre-registering prevents p-hacking, prevents people from actually like saying they're doing equity work just because it will get them into the article. The next tenet is that categories are neither neutral nor given. So they're arbitrary. There's no right set because race is made up. There is no right set. And they keep changing too. It's not fixed. As the world keeps changing and as we keep changing as people, they keep changing. But the reason I advocate for collecting as accurate data as possible is because it affects funding and resource allocation. And I want funding to go to communities of color. And the way you disaggregate your data or the way you collect your data will paint different pictures of inequity. And in young people, it's actually really, really important to continue to measure race and ethnicity data because their identities change. After George Floyd, many multiracial people who might have identified as white, I started to identify as people of color. So thinking about how their identity is changing with the events of the world and with what's going on. So this is just a classic example of disaggregation, to your point, where this is access to elite universities. And on the right, we have Black and minority ethnic. And on the left, we have white British people. And my co-author is from the UK. So he knew that you had to disaggregate that because there's Black Caribbeans and Indian populations, and they don't have access to elite universities at the same rate. So disaggregation is important. But when you're reading this, you want to read for race, you say racism. So you say race, instead of saying race is related, you say racism is related to access to UK universities and racist patterns of inequity are related with racial and ethnic origin. Students are not born Black, Caribbean, and have this relationship that is inherent, that is what society has put on them. And I want to collect more granular and nuanced data, because I want to allocate more money to these populations. But we want to think carefully which data, and I can't tell you what are the right categories, which people don't like, but it depends on your research population and depends where you're studying, right? Where you're going to collect. California is going to look different from Ohio. It's going to look different from Chicago. And it just, why are you even using them in the first place? So going back to like, why are you even using them and do you need them? If you do need them, then you have to consider which are the best ones for that community. For example, Latinx is used a lot in the academic world, but potentially that's not the best thing to use for communities who might actually resonate with that. So thinking about nuances of how maybe you don't just need to look at race, maybe you need to also make sure you're getting different measures of heterosexism, of ableism, not just thinking about racial categories. And then we want to avoid creating arbitrary categories where we lump people together. This happens a lot post data where we like lump non-white with white or other. So avoid re-racializing people, because if they didn't identify as other, we shouldn't put them as other in our in our study. I like to suggest to do check all so people can have options to put every race ethnicity that they are that they identify with. But one thing that I started to think about is who inputs the ethnicity data that you receive. So do you guys know who inputs yours? Because before I started to ask this question, I never knew. Like, I just get data, right? And it says Latino, but like, who put it in there? And that's part of our responsibility. And this is qualitative research, to go look and see, was it the teacher? Was it the parents? Was it school staff? A lot of re-racialization happens at the administration level when teachers submit the information cards. And there's a study where the secretary for multiracial people, she'd be like, Black Latino, oh, her mom looks more Black, she's Black. So a lot of that re-racialization happens. So just knowing how these numbers that you're getting, numbers related to race, are happening. So do you guys know where you get your data from? If you get quantitative data. And also when kids are older, do they fill it out or is it still their parents? It's just important to think about. So I just want to be clear that if you disaggregate data, you're not doing QuantCrit, and that is not an equity lens. I heard people saying that I was saying disaggregate, and that's not, and I'm like, yes, I want people to disaggregate, but that is the bare minimum. That is like the floor. So you should have been doing that like 30 years ago, but when you first got data. But I'm not saying now you disaggregate, oh, now I'm doing racial equity. No, like you should though, if that's what your study wants to do, because you should to identify needs, to make sure that services are accessible. But I just want to say that disaggregating data is important, but like if you just do disaggregate, it's not all of a sudden you're doing racial equity. Here's just some examples that I just wanted to present. ARA is the one on the right, and the University of California is the one on the left, and they just have a lot more different options. ARA has Pacific Islander, but also options within the Pacific Islander, Asian, but also options within Asian. University of California, I think, needs more Latino options, but it has a lot of white options, which is really interesting. I don't know what they do with that, but this is the white column. This is the Asian column. This is the American Indian column, which I think they need more of. This is a Latino, which I thought would be more because you're in California. This is the Black column. But they have, at least they have these data, and they're collecting it more than other people. And some school districts in Oregon and Washington also collect data to this granularity. The next tenet is voice and insight. Data cannot speak for itself. So we want to contextualize and interpret data. This is not quant research. In some ways, this is qual research, right? You want to contextualize your data. Is it significant statistically? Yes or no? You always put that usually, but is it meaningfully significant? Like if you increased test scores by 2 points, does that mean anything to anybody? Thinking about those things and then putting it in context of, well, 70% graduation rate here in this example for Latino students. I remember when I was working at the Urban League, they're like, that sounds really bad. And I'm like, well, if you think about it, like, let's look at nationally, let's look at statewide, let's look at other people in the community. It's actually really, really, really good, but people just like numbers like in the 90s and 80s. That's our bias to go towards the 80s and 90s, but just, we need to contextualize it because numbers without context don't mean anything. And we can ground truth our data. And what ground truthing your data is once you're done with your quantitative project, you go and ask people. And this is not participatory. Participatory would mean you involve them from the beginning. But ground truthing your data would be that you go and ask people, do these analyses resonate with you? Do these results resonate with you? Do you think are we missing something? You can do this through a data walk. You can do it through an advisory board, but the idea comes from like grounding it on the truth. And it actually came from a GIS and more hard science, and where people were ground truthing their data by doing like GIS and looking to see if the data that they predicted was actually there. But now we're using it in QuantCrit. Interpreting our results by centering racism. So in this example, Van Dusen uses Gloria Ladson-Billings' framing of debts to society to interpret their effect size. So it's our responsibility to interpret our data and put context around it. So rather than saying there was an effect size of 2, he said Black men's average scores were lower than white men's average scores. Society would have to provide opportunities equivalent to taking the course up to 2.5 times to repay the largest debts to society, educational debts. So you're putting it in that context versus saying effect size of 2.5, which is a really big effect. Then there's data counter storytelling, which is the idea that, statistics always give you an average. And just so you all know, averages are not real people. They are averages, and that person does not exist. So averages usually applies to the majoritized group, which is often in our data white people. And again, it makes white people's experiences normal and traditional. So it's important to think about counter storytelling that defy the average, whichever way we're talking about, because average is not real. And this is counter storytelling is a CRT qualitative methodology that people use quite often. But in data, I feel like I've only seen 2 or 3 papers, and I hope I do one because I'm really excited about data counter storytelling. You can also tell it with your graphics. This is W.E.B. Du Bois that he presented at the World Fair in Paris. And you can see that he was using data to tell stories, and he wasn't letting it speak for itself, in the sense that, like, you can tell here, you can tell how many people who are Black live in particular states. You can see who was enslaved and who wasn't enslaved. He was using cool visualizations about it. You can also look at that hashtag. There's so many more. It's very cool. And the last one is social justice and equity orientation. And I want to just put some questions on how we consume and teach quantitative methods, because that's what we usually do. We teach quantitative methods or we consume them. So we need to think about, are we teaching the racist history of quant data? Are we making efforts to state our biases? Are we using like survey items and questions that are asset-based, that are putting race at the center and having us think about what that means for the question? And are we taking into account our interpretations of how we interpret this within the context of racism? So I want to talk about positionality. Positionality, who's heard of positionality? I hope everyone. Okay, so I feel like I've been making a lot of inroads in making quantitative researchers create positionality statements, because quant data is not neutral, and we have our own biases and our own experiences that influence that. So a positionality statement is to be able to address and understand those potential biases that we have. It's an investigation of power and the power and position that we have. But for QuantCrit particularly, it's important to think about your statistical training. And everyone's statistical training is, from my knowledge, I don't think anyone is being trained in critical quant, is traditional. So we have to say, like, I come from our traditional. I always say that in my positionality statement. I was trained traditionally, thinking about the power of the institutions that you work in and what kind of privileges you have because of that. Thinking about your research team. If you're working on a research team, what are your positions and what are your, like, the holes or perspectives that you're missing? And writing a team positionality statement. And it's not a checklist. It's something you're supposed to be thinking about. I have a huge potential bias, which I forget Indigenous populations a lot. And the reason I forget them is because I grew up in a very urban environment without Indigenous populations. So that is one of my biases. And I like to state that to my team so that they can remind me to make sure that I'm thinking about Indigenous populations. That's one of my biases. Has anyone seen a positionality statement in a quant paper before? I have. Well, that's because I'm like literally trying to find the three that exist, but I have. And here's an example of it. And here is a white researcher from Australia saying, I'm a non-Indigenous researcher. I don't represent the standpoints of the First Nations people, but I think this is important work to do. He wants to examine and challenge the conventional wisdom about the role that education plays. And here's mine in my book. It's really long. So all this is from my book. It's really, really long because it's a book. In the article, I would never do it that long. But it's very important for me to say that I viewed statistics as part of understanding the white man's language, and that's why I learned it. But I was trained in experimental methods. I was trained in positivism and post-positivism. I was not trained in critical, like any type of critical theory. I was not. That's important for me to be upfront about it. Other things that are important about my positionality is that like I went through this like reckoning where I realized that the research that I was doing was replicating the status quo. And I learned from those mistakes, and I realized that I didn't want to do that again. And that's how I came to become like a QuantCrit scholar. But I don't consider myself a CRT theorist. I am not a CRT scholar. But I look forward to like fine-tuning and understanding the theory and conceptualizing how to apply it. So this is my positionality statement. And I also talk about how I attended fancy Ivy League institutions, have taught at Princeton, and now I am in a place of privilege. So that's also important for me to acknowledge, where society views those sources of knowledge as more reliable. And I want to very specifically uplift the voices of community members. I do not intend to speak for the voiceless. And I recognize my street race is mestiza, and I recognize that in some spaces I am white passing Latino. And I recognize also that I have a bias to help Black and Brown students, and I don't want to get rid of it. I am proud of it. And now that people read this and read it in my articles, you can take what I say with a grain of salt. I'm being upfront. Other people just don't. Everybody has somebody that they center. Everybody has biases. The idea is to be upfront about it. So I try to model that. And then the last thing I want to talk about is go over existing and overused metrics. So most metrics that we use were created by white men or white women and were consciously centered. We're not consciously centered on Black and Latino students, but centered on white individuals. And do communities, Black and Brown communities, even value those metrics? So here are just some that I came up with, but there are so many. Critical consciousness, access to dual language, number of after-school activities. So we can think of different metrics that are available. So here are some. Here's an example of somebody who did this really, really well. So Reynolds and Tabron wanted to look at principals, why there weren't a lot of Black principals. So rather than saying there's 20 Black principals and 50 white principals, rather than doing that, they looked at where in the pipeline are Black principals being excluded? Which parts of it? Is it in the application? Is it in the written requirements for the application? Like, where are Black applicants to be principals being screened out? So they're really looking at it through that pipeline versus saying at the end we have this many and this many. So they created a rubric. Kristen Pretty, really good friend of mine, wanted to look at Black students' experiences in STEM. And rather than thinking about the regular or like the normatized barriers, she said, I want to measure acting white and how that affects STEM. I want to measure Black stereotypes and microaggressions. I want to measure Black women tropes of angry Black women, how that is. And those measures don't exist. So she had to create them for her dissertation. But the idea is like, now I'm centering Black people in this dissertation. Now, what measures do I need? And she had to create them. There are tensions, though. Statistical training. Oh yeah, I'm almost done. Statistical training is not happening through a QuantCrit lens. So like, how do we get like people who are already teaching to get this? And then there's logical landmines. So when you make one thing equitable, then another thing becomes inequitable in the data. And that's really huge. One thing that I want to talk about is intersectionality. I think that there comes a point where numbers hit a wall and racism, and then now thinking about intersectionality, which adds another dimension to racism. I'm not sure we can ever get to quantifying these things, but I think we can aspire to them. So it is just like a tension of aspiring to measuring these things. And with that, I'll close with just some food for thought, and then there's resources there. But I don't know how much time we have for questions, sorry. Oh, damn.
No, okay, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. What are you thinking about the fundamental problem of moving people into limited number of categories, since we're immediately treating all individuals within groups as same? That's just what group does, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we say black people, white people, we, as soon as we do that, we're treating members of the group as the same. How do you go around it? Because we also know that variations within groups are often much larger than variations between groups, especially when we group whole humanity into 5 categories plus other.
That's right.
So, uh, we do want to do business with all of us, but considering the problems this construct of race from the beginning, but also in general, any kind of grouping of humanity into 6 categories and then acting as if members of the categories are equivalent. There's a problem for our understanding of the world, so.
Yeah, I advocate for getting as much nuance as possible when you collect, but ultimately, and this is something I want to learn, is it relies on mixed methods, right? Numbers are only going to give you one story, or they actually can give you multiple stories depending on how you slice the data. But I think if you really want the more rich picture, you need the qualitative piece. And I'm not a mixed methods researcher, but I want to be, because I don't think we can ever, we're going to have to group them because of numbers, and whatever number the grouping might be 20 groups, but they're still grouping, like as you said. But ultimately, I think to get that other dimension, you need that qualitative piece to give those who don't fall into the averages or to the norm their space and their voice. Eva?
I love the slide on that you showed. About how processes of racialization work in education.
Thank you. And I think just like knowing the context of like the UK, when I've seen researchers in the UK, they collect like Bangladeshi, they collect like Caribbean, they collect a lot different than maybe we would collect. And that's because they know their context.
California, that by race. It was interesting how their category for white is as lengthy as it was. And the people have been, this is people hitting them more, they look at.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. I don't know what they do with all their white data. Like,
There are so many different, perspectives and orientations to individuals who might identify.
mm-hmm. Anybody else have one more question or two? I've never taught it to undergrads before, but I have taught it to juniors. I think it's varying. For some, I think the master's students were really very like, they were like, yes, this is like what I've been looking for, but I couldn't put like a language to it. So you've given me a language to talk about these things that I always knew, the master's students. And then some of the, when I've taught juniors before, some of them have said I'm brainwashing them. Other people have said, no, but other people have also like really embraced it too. And they're like, oh, this makes so much sense. So I think it's mixed. But I think at the graduate level, it's been more of like, I always wanted to talk about this, but I didn't have the language and now I do. Because they don't know how to put like that. Like we know it's not, but how do I critique it without knowing the language behind it?
So important to me. Thank you for a great talk. I'm a historian, so I've been looking at data related to school segregation, but I've been looking at more recent data, like the past 50 or 60 years. And a lot of school districts just made up racial categories, like depending on where they were and what they were talking about. And it's like unbelievable that they were doing this, and then incredibly challenging to try to go back and you're looking at Minneapolis in 1960 and trying to figure out what minority student or minority teacher, and then they're talking, oh, Black people this and minority people that, and oh, Native American students this, and they're like, oh, who's left in minority? But
Was Italian in there too? Sometimes that one, yeah. Yeah, the Italian is in New York City.
Such important work. I'm so glad that you're here, that you're doing it and sharing it with not only all of us, but our undergraduate students too.
So all this is in the book and it comes out in a month. I'm so excited. Yeah. And it's free. You can download it. You just download it. So. Oh, right.
I always do that with my books and the books I use in class, and the librarians are very good about making books available. You just ask.
Yeah, it's a good primer for like people who just want to know like what is critical race theory, what is QuantCrit, and like for people who like just like want to teach it in their class, it's a really easy, simple. Well, it's not easy read, but it simplifies it. Yes.
Thanks again. Thank you. Okay, special thank you to the ADP Center for hosting us. I think we've all come to really appreciate this space and the tech services that you all provide. It's really nice. Thank you, Sumi, and the Dean's Office for supporting this initiative. Thanks to you all for coming. Please encourage your colleagues to come. This really is part of an effort that I'm working on, Carlos and Danae Davis. We're trying to just kind of like, we have such smart people in our college. We love hearing about their work. So join us at these events when you can, online, in person, they're recorded. Encourage your colleagues to come because I think it's a really great chance for us to learn more about each other's scholarship and one that's valuable. And bring students. Yeah, by all means, let me know ahead of time if you want to bring students. According to Carlos, we're hoping to have Professor Suman Rath at our next talk, which is very exciting. And that will be Wednesday, November 6th. Same time, 11:30, same place. It's also a meeting day, so it should fit nicely into your schedule if we're lucky. And we will have one more meeting after that in December, also on a meeting day, to be determined who that's going to be, but it's in the works and should come from teaching and learning. So that's it for today. Please help yourself to coffee, and thanks again to everybody for coming.